I remember standing in the dim quiet of my living room, the air still thick with the scent of lilies from Harold's funeral, when I felt the first crack inside me. My son's footsteps had barely faded from the hallway, yet his coldness echoed louder than any slam of a door. My hands were still trembling, not from grief alone, but from a kind of disbelief that stung deeper than loss. If you've ever felt blindsided by someone you thought you could trust, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. It helps more than you know. The sunlight outside looked almost foreign that day, too bright for a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar. And as I stood there, surrounded by his untouched coffee mug and the wilted flowers of goodbye, I didn't yet realize this was only the beginning. Let me show you how it all began. I never expected the sharpest blow of the day to come after the funeral was over. When the guests had gone home and the house sat in that strange stillness that follows loss. I was standing in my own living room, surrounded by half-wilted flowers and untouched casserole dishes, when I felt my son's distance hit me harder than the grief itself. There was something cold in the way he moved around me, something dismissive that made me feel small, as if I were an inconvenience he had been forced to manage. I remember watching him walk through Harold's study like it already belonged to someone else, and the way my chest tightened at the realization that he wasn't seeing me as a mother who had just buried her husband, but as a burden he needed to control. The numbness from the funeral hadn't worn off, and yet there was a sting underneath it, a quiet disbelief that my own child could be so unaffected. My hands kept shaking as I straightened the stack of sympathy cards, trying to ground myself in something gentle, something familiar. But even the soft light in the house felt different, as if grief had pulled the edges of everything out of focus. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, trying to understand how we had gotten here. How could someone I raised with tenderness treat me with such impatience on the day I needed compassion the most? That question stayed with me long after he walked out the door. And as I sat alone in that dim, quiet room, I realized I had to look back, far back, if I wanted to understand how my own son became a stranger. I think back to the life I built long before everything fell apart, and it feels almost like looking through softened glass. My years with Harold were steady and familiar, not perfect, but grounded in a kind of partnership that made me feel safe. I had dreams of my own once, a small career that I stepped away from when the children came, believing it was the right thing to do. I told myself I didn't mind, and for a long time, I didn't. I poured myself into our home, our family, and the quiet routines that shaped my days. Ryan, as the oldest, always carried himself with a certain seriousness. Even as a boy, he liked being the one who understood things first, the one who stepped in when his siblings fussed or when I seemed overwhelmed. I suppose I leaned on that. I let myself believe he would always be the steady one. When Harold's health began to decline, that dynamic deepened. Ryan was the one who handled the doctors, the medications, the decisions I didn't feel strong enough to make. At first, I was grateful. It felt like he was protecting us. But over time, I felt a subtle shift, moments when he dismissed my questions or brushed past my attempts to stay involved. I remember the way he would sigh, not loudly, but in a way that made me feel like a burden. I tried to ignore it. I told myself he was stressed, that caretaking was heavy for all of us. Looking back now, those were the earliest signs, little red flags I tucked away because it was easier to trust than confront the possibility that something was changing in him. Or maybe in all of us. And as I sit here remembering the long months of Harold's illness, I can see how each small compromise, each moment I stepped back, quietly set the stage for what happened in the days after the funeral, when Ryan's pressure only grew stronger. The days following the funeral blurred together in a strange mixture of noise and emptiness. People kept coming in and out of the house, offering casseroles, quick embraces, and awkward promises to check in. I moved through it all as if I were underwater, watching my own life unfold at a distance. The rooms felt crowded and hollow at the same time, filled with voices but missing the one voice I wanted most. I remember standing by the kitchen counter, holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold, unsure how long I had been standing there. Ryan handled everything with a kind of clipped efficiency that left no room for me to breathe. He organized the service, managed the flowers, spoke with the funeral director, and gave instructions to relatives as if he were the only adult in the room. At first, I told myself he was trying to relieve my burden, but there was an edge to it, an urgency that didn't feel like compassion. It felt like control. The moments when I was finally alone were the only times grief settled fully on my shoulders. In those quiet minutes, I would find myself in Harold's study, tracing the grain of his desk, trying to steady my heartbeat. Yet every time I stepped out, someone else was asking me to sign something, confirm something, or approve a detail I barely understood. By midweek, Ryan began bringing up bills, overdue notices, and what he called a looming financial problem. He spoke as if the house were already too much for me, as if decisions needed to be made immediately. The way he moved through the paperwork, the certainty in his tone, made me feel like I was being ushered into choices I didn't fully grasp. I could sense a shift, subtle but undeniable. This wasn't help. It was acceleration. And as the week drew on, a quiet alarm grew in me, warning that the pressure was only beginning. Ryan showed up the next morning with a kind of determined energy that filled the room before I could even gather myself. I was sitting at the dining table, still in the clothes I had worn the night before, trying to steady my thoughts. He moved around me with an authority that felt foreign, dropping a stack of glossy brochures onto the table as if he had already decided everything. I remember staring at the bright images of smiling seniors in tidy hallways, feeling a strange heat rise in my chest. It was the first time I truly felt him speaking around me instead of to me, treating me as though I were fragile, confused, and incapable of knowing what was best for my own life. Every gesture carried a dismissive undertone, the way he pointed at the pages, the way he nudged the brochures closer, the way he kept scanning the house as though he were assessing it for liquidation. Grief had left my defenses thin, and in that vulnerability, his confidence felt overwhelming. I kept wondering when I had started appearing so small in his eyes. When had my role shifted from mother to burden? The more he pushed, the more a quiet desperation built inside me. I felt pressed into an emotional corner, as if my own home were no longer truly mine. There was a moment, sharp and unforgettable, when humiliation washed over me, followed by a deep, aching sense of betrayal. It wasn't about assisted living. It was about being pushed out of my own life without a voice. As he spoke over me once again, something inside me finally cracked. I realized I needed answers, real answers, not the ones he handed me with his impatience. After he left, I found myself walking toward Harold's old office, feeling a pull I couldn't ignore. It was time to look at the papers I had avoided for far too long. The house felt strangely still after Ryan left, as if his urgency had scraped the air clean. I found myself moving down the hallway without thinking, drawn toward Harold's old office. That room had always carried his scent: paper, ink, a hint of cedar, and stepping inside felt like walking into a preserved version of him. Dust clung to the edge of the desk lamp, and a thin layer had settled over the folders he once kept so meticulously. I hesitated, feeling that old familiar knot in my stomach, the one tied to years of telling myself I wasn't good with numbers, that Harold and later Ryan understood these things better than I ever could. Still, I opened the top drawer. The first stack of papers nearly made my heart drop. Overdue notices, highlighted totals, circled dates. They made me wonder if Ryan had been right, if things truly were falling apart without me realizing it. For a moment, shame washed over me. Had I really been so unaware? But as I sifted further, something didn't add up. The bills felt scattered, incomplete, almost staged in their disorder, and buried underneath them, almost intentionally hidden, was a slim envelope holding a bank card I had never seen before. The logo wasn't from our regular bank. My hands trembled as I held it, a prickle of unease spreading across my skin. Confusion shifted into suspicion, and then a quiet, determined clarity. Harold would never have kept something like this from me, not unless there was more to the story. I knew, right then, I needed to go to that bank myself. The truth wasn't in these papers. It was waiting somewhere else, and I was finally ready to face it. Walking into the private bank on Monday morning felt like stepping into another world. The floors shone like polished stone, and every sound seemed softened by the way the space absorbed light. I stood there, clutching Harold's unfamiliar bank card, feeling painfully aware of my worn coat and the way my hands kept tightening around the strap of my purse. For a moment, I thought someone would question why I was there, as if I didn't belong in a place built for people who carried confidence like a second skin. But the staff greeted me with a level of warmth and respect that caught me off guard. They looked at me as if I were someone of importance, someone whose presence mattered. It made something inside me shift, just slightly, a recognition that I had been underestimated for far too long, even by myself. When the account information was finally placed before me, my breath caught. I had expected modest savings, maybe something Harold tucked away for emergencies. Instead, I saw numbers that made my heart pound in my ears. Investments, accounts, holdings, layers of wealth accumulated quietly over decades. All while we clipped coupons and stretched every dollar. I felt a wave of disbelief so strong it made my vision blur. How could he have kept this from me? And then came the second blow, the notes showing that Ryan had been managing pieces of these accounts. Familiar signatures tied to transfers I never knew existed. It felt like the floor tilted beneath me. Betrayal from both sides, one rooted in secrecy, the other in opportunism. I sat there, absorbing it all, feeling the shock melt into something steadier, sharper. For the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of strength kindle inside me. Whatever had been hidden from me, whatever had been done without my knowledge, I could no longer afford to step back. I walked out of that bank knowing one thing with absolute clarity: it was time to take control of my life, fully and without apology. Taking control of my life started with a single, steady decision: I needed someone who would speak to me as an equal. That clarity carried me into the office of a financial consultant named Marissa Hale. A woman who greeted me with a kind of calm professionalism I had not felt directed toward me in years. From the moment we sat down, I sensed something shift. She looked at me as if I were capable, intelligent, and deserving of understanding. It was almost startling how healing simple respect could feel. As I laid out what I had discovered, she walked me through every piece of my financial reality. I listened, absorbing details I had once convinced myself were beyond my grasp. With each explanation, I felt a layer of fog lift. I learned where the accounts were, how they worked, and what steps I needed to take to secure them. She helped me restructure access, change passwords, and remove Ryan from anything tied to my name. The moment I completed those steps, I felt an unexpected strength settle into my chest. Like a part of me that had been asleep for decades was waking up. From there, I met with an estate lawyer, determined to protect myself legally. We reviewed documents I had never truly understood before, and with patience, he helped me revise them so they reflected my wishes rather than the assumptions my family had made on my behalf. Signing those papers felt like reclaiming a part of my identity. By the end of the week, the woman who walked into the bank trembling had been replaced by someone steadier, someone who finally believed she could stand on her own. I knew Ryan would not accept these changes quietly. A confrontation was inevitable, but for the first time, the thought did not paralyze me. I was ready for whatever came next. I began noticing the cracks in Ryan's composure almost immediately after I secured my accounts. There was a frantic edge to him that hadn't been there before, something brittle beneath his usual confidence. At first, I thought it was grief working its way through him in strange, uneven bursts. But as the days passed, it became impossible to ignore the way his eyes darted around my house, lingering on files, drawers, anything that might contain what he believed he needed. The truth came to me in fragments. A comment from a neighbor about his long absences. A stack of unopened mail he had left in my kitchen that wasn't mine. The way he paced outside on phone calls, voice tightened by panic. When I finally allowed myself to look deeper, everything aligned in a way that made my stomach drop. His career, the one he'd always spoken about with pride, was unraveling. Missed benchmarks, lost clients, complaints filed quietly against him. I realized he had been slipping long before Harold passed, and the pressure he put on me had always been tangled with the pressure closing in on him. The final piece came when I reviewed one of the statements Marissa had helped me retrieve. There were withdrawals tied to Ryan months before Harold's death. Transfers he had no reason to make except desperation. I sat there, letting the weight of it settle. I kept seeing his earlier urgency through new eyes. He had not been pushing me toward assisted living out of concern. He had been cornered, terrified, and grasping for control over what he assumed was still hidden money. The heartbreak was sharp, but beneath it was a cold, steady clarity. My son wasn't just overwhelmed. He was drowning, and he was reaching for me not out of love, but out of need. Dangerous, consuming need. I knew then that this situation was far from over, and whatever came next, I had to be prepared to protect myself. I sensed it the moment I stepped onto the porch. Something in the air felt disturbed, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. At first, I tried to blame my nerves, the lingering tension from everything I had uncovered about Ryan. But when I turned the key and pushed the door open, the heaviness inside told me the truth before I saw a single thing. The entryway rug was crooked. A drawer in the hallway table sat slightly open. Small things, almost nothing on their own, yet they struck me with the force of a confession. I walked deeper into the house, feeling my heartbeat climb with every step. The living room cushions were out of place. A stack of mail had been rifled through. In Harold's office, folders were pulled from the cabinet, some on the floor, some spread across the desk like someone had torn through them in a hurry. I stood there, surrounded by the evidence of hands that did not belong in my home. The sense of violation washed over me slowly, like cold water creeping up my spine. And then, just as slowly, the realization settled in. This was not random. No stranger would know exactly where to look, what to touch, what might be valuable. The only person who would search these drawers with that desperate precision was Ryan. The heartbreak hit harder than any discovery of hidden wealth or past deception. This was intentional. This was personal. My own son had crossed the threshold of my home, of my trust, and torn through the pieces of my life as if he had a right to them. For a moment, I felt myself collapsing under the weight of it. But then something steady rose beneath the pain. A cold, clear resolve. If he was willing to go this far, then I had to go farther in protecting myself. I gathered the scattered papers, my hands steadier than I expected, already thinking about locks, boundaries, and the life I needed to build next. One where safety and peace would finally come from my own decisions. In the days after the break-in, my home felt unfamiliar, as if someone had shifted its foundation while I slept. Yet once the initial shock settled, a quiet determination took its place. I changed the locks, added security measures, and informed my lawyer of everything. Creating distance from Ryan was painful, but necessary. I needed space where my safety and sanity were not up for negotiation. Taking these steps grounded me. I moved slowly through each room, putting items back where they belonged, dusting shelves, straightening pictures, reclaiming the space with deliberate care. With every small act, I felt a little more anchored. Harold's office, once a source of anxiety, became a place of order again. I stored documents properly, organized files, and reminded myself that I was capable of managing my own life. My days gradually found a new rhythm. I began my mornings with a walk around the neighborhood, letting the cool air clear the last traces of fear from my chest. I cooked meals that felt comforting, not rushed. I spent afternoons tending to the small garden Harold once doted on, discovering that nurturing something living brought a sense of peace I had nearly forgotten. Evenings were simple, soft light, a good book, and the steady hum of a house that finally felt like mine again. There were moments when grief resurfaced, or when a memory of Ryan's face tightened my throat. But those moments no longer controlled me. I had built boundaries, solid ones, and they held. For the first time in a long while, I felt my life settling into a shape that belonged to me, not to obligation, not to fear, not to someone else's expectations. And as I stood in the quiet of my home, I felt the next reflection rising inside me, ready to bring this chapter to a close and open whatever waits ahead. When I look back on everything that has happened, I'm struck by how quietly a life can unravel, and how quietly it can be rebuilt. I spent so many years believing that love meant surrender, that aging meant fading, that boundaries were something other people were allowed to have. But I learned that trust needs protection, that self-worth does not expire with time, and that even in the later chapters of life, we are allowed to begin again. I'm not the same woman who stood in that fog after Harold's funeral. I'm steadier now, more rooted, more willing to choose myself. And if my story says anything, I hope it reminds someone listening that it's never too late to reclaim your voice. Have you ever faced a moment that forced you to start over? Share it in the comments. I read every word.